Welcome back to the Historian's Tome, where history becomes your gentle companion into sleep. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the past. We'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Leave a comment below and let us know. Perhaps it's late evening or maybe the middle of the night. Wherever you are, whatever the hour, you're in the right place. Tonight, we travel back over 1,000 years to discover the Sogdians, the merchants who connected empires along the Silk Road. So settle into your blankets, close your eyes, and let this ancient story carry you peacefully into dreams. In the heart of Central Asia, where two great rivers flowed through desert valleys, there existed a land of remarkable cities. This was Sogdiana, home to a people who would become the most successful merchants the ancient world had ever known. The land lay between the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers in what we now call Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. It was neither the largest territory nor the most powerful kingdom, yet its people would leave their mark across thousands of miles. The Sogdians did not build their success on conquest or military might. Instead, they built it on something far more enduring. They understood trade, languages, and the art of making connections between distant peoples. While empires rose and fell around them, the Sogdians quietly became indispensable to all of them. Their story begins around 2,000 years ago, though their civilization was already ancient by then. The land of Sogdiana was fertile in the river valleys, producing grapes, wheat, and other crops. The mountains nearby held minerals and precious stones, but the greatest resource of Sogdiana was not what came from the ground. It was the position of the land itself. Sogdiana sat at a crossroads. To the east lay China, with its silk and porcelain. To the west lay Persia, and eventually the Mediterranean world, hungry for exotic goods from the east. To the south were the roads to India. To the north stretched the steppes where nomadic peoples roamed. The Sogdians looked at this geography and saw not danger, but opportunity. The major cities of Sogdiana became centers of culture and commerce. Samarkand, perhaps the most famous, grew into a jewel of Central Asia. Its markets buzzed with activity. Merchants from many lands gathered there, speaking dozens of languages, trading goods from across the known world. Bukhara, another great city, became known for its learning and its wealthy traders. These cities were built with mud brick and decorated with beautiful paintings. The Sogdians loved art and music. Their homes featured paintings of feasts, hunting scenes, and religious ceremonies. They played instruments and celebrated life with enthusiasm. But they never forgot that their prosperity came from trade, and trade required travel. The young Sogdian boy growing up in Samarkand knew from an early age that his future likely involved long journeys. He would learn to speak multiple languages. He would study mathematics to calculate profits and losses. He would learn to ride horses and camels. Most importantly, he would learn the family trade, whatever it might be, and he would learn the routes that his father and grandfather had traveled. Sogdian families often specialized in certain types of goods. Some dealt primarily in silk from China. Others focused on glassware from the Roman world. Still others traded in spices, precious stones, or metals. But successful Sogdian merchants never limited themselves to just one type of product. Flexibility was survival. When silk was in high demand, they carried silk. When the market shifted, they shifted with it. The Sogdian language became a language of commerce across Central Asia. It was written in a script derived from Aramaic, the ancient language of the Middle East. Sogdian letters and contracts have been found scattered across the Silk Road, from the deserts of western China to the markets of the Black Sea. These documents tell us about prices, partnerships, and the daily concerns of merchants far from home. But language was just one tool in the Sogdian merchants' kit. They also mastered the art of adaptation. When they traveled to China, they learned Chinese customs. When they traded in Persian lands, they adopted Persian ways. This ability to fit in, to become part of many different societies while maintaining their own identity, set them apart from other trading peoples. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a network of routes stretching across Asia. These routes connected China in the east with the Mediterranean in the west, crossing some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. There were high mountain passes where the air grew thin and cold. There were vast deserts where water was scarce and the sun was merciless. There were forests and steppes, rivers and gorges. Traveling these routes required courage, knowledge, and resources. The Sogdians did not create the Silk Road, but they perfected the art of traveling it. They established communities at key points along the routes. These communities served as rest stops, trading posts, and information centers. A Sogdian merchant arriving in a distant city could find fellow Sogdians who spoke his language, understood his religion, and could help him conduct business. In the Chinese city of Dunhuang, at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, there was a significant Sogdian community. Dunhuang was a crucial point where merchants prepared for the desert crossing or rested after completing it. The Sogdians there ran hostels, stables, and warehouses. They exchanged currency and shared news from the west. They made the dangerous journey possible for others. Further west, in cities along the Tarim Basin, more Sogdian communities flourished. In Turfan, in Kucha, in Kashgar, the Sogdians were a familiar presence. They built temples for their religion. They created schools for their children. They maintained their customs while also participating fully in the local economy. This pattern repeated across Central Asia. The caravan was the basic unit of Silk Road trade. A typical caravan might include dozens or even hundreds of camels, along with drivers, guards, merchants, and servants. The Bactrian camel, with its 2 humps, was perfectly suited for the cold deserts of Central Asia. These camels could go for days without water and could carry heavy loads across difficult terrain. Organizing a caravan required substantial investment. The animals had to be purchased or rented. Guards had to be hired to protect against bandits. Supplies had to be laid in for the journey. Payments had to be made to local rulers for safe passage through their territories. The risks were real. Caravans could be attacked, lost in sandstorms, or trapped by winter snows in mountain passes. To manage these risks, Sogdian merchants developed sophisticated business practices. They formed partnerships, spreading the risk among several investors. They used letters of credit, allowing them to transfer funds across vast distances without carrying large amounts of coins or precious metals. They established reputation systems, where a merchant's honesty and reliability became his most valuable asset. The journey from China to Central Asia typically took months. The route from Chang'an, the Chinese capital, first went northwest through the Gansu Corridor, a narrow passage between mountains and desert. This corridor was dotted with garrison towns and watchtowers, part of China's defensive system. Chinese authorities monitored who came and went, collecting taxes on goods. After Dunhuang, merchants faced a choice. They could take the northern route around the Taklamakan Desert or the southern route. Both had challenges. The northern route passed through somewhat better supplied oasis towns, but was longer. The southern route was more direct, but crossed even harsher desert. Some caravans split up, with different groups taking different routes to spread risk or pursue different trading opportunities. The oasis towns that dotted these routes depended on water from mountain snowmelt. Around each oasis, farmers grew crops and raised animals. The towns had markets where local goods could be traded. They had workshops where craftsmen made textiles, metalwork, and pottery. These towns were diverse places, home to many ethnic groups and religious traditions. The Sogdians moved easily through this world. They spoke the local languages and respected local customs. When they arrived in a town, they didn't act as foreigners trying to impose their ways. Instead, they found common ground, established friendships, and conducted business in ways that benefited everyone involved. At night, in the caravanserais where merchants rested, stories were told. The Sogdians were great storytellers. They shared news from distant lands. They told of wonders they had seen, of strange customs and remarkable people. These stories entertained, but also served a practical purpose. Information was valuable. Knowing which routes were safe, which cities had good markets, which rulers were friendly to merchants could mean the difference between profit and loss. Religion played a central role in Sogdian life, but not in the way we might expect. The Sogdians originally practiced Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion that saw the world as a battle between good and evil, light and darkness. Their main deity was Ahura Mazda, the wise lord. They maintained fire temples where sacred flames burned continuously. Fire was considered pure and holy. Zoroastrian beliefs influenced Sogdian ethics. The religion emphasized truth-telling, keeping promises and treating others fairly. These values served Sogdian merchants well. A reputation for honesty was essential in long-distance trade, where contracts might not be enforceable through any legal system. A merchant's word had to be his bond, but as the Sogdians spread across Asia, they encountered other religions. Buddhism was growing in influence along the Silk Road. Christian missionaries from Persia brought their faith eastward. Manichaeism, a religion that combined elements of Christianity, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism, attracted followers. Later, Islam would spread across Central Asia. The remarkable thing about the Sogdians was their religious flexibility. While some remained devoted Zoroastrians, others converted to Buddhism, Christianity, or Manichaeism. Some Sogdian communities supported temples of multiple faiths. They seemed to understand that religious tolerance was good for business. A merchant who could participate in the religious life of many communities had more opportunities. In China, many Sogdians became Buddhists. This made sense for several reasons. Buddhism was respected in China, especially during certain dynasties. Buddhist monasteries often served as banks and warehouses, places where merchants could safely store goods and money. By becoming Buddhist, Sogdians could access these networks and gain acceptance in Chinese society. The Sogdians didn't just adopt Buddhism superficially. They became serious practitioners and important supporters. They funded the construction of Buddhist caves and temples. They commissioned translations of Buddhist texts. Some Sogdians became monks or scholars of Buddhism. The famous Dunhuang caves, filled with Buddhist art and manuscripts, were partly funded by Sogdian merchants. Christianity also found followers among the Sogdians. The Church of the East, sometimes called Nestorian Christianity, spread along the Silk Road from Persia. Sogdian Christians established churches in Central Asian cities and even in China. Archaeological evidence shows Sogdian Christian communities thriving in places far from Christianity's Mediterranean homeland. These Sogdian Christians maintained their faith while continuing their trading activities. They saw no contradiction between spiritual devotion and commercial success. Their churches served as community centers where Sogdians could gather, speak their language, and maintain their identity while living far from home. Manichaeism had a special appeal to some Sogdians. Founded by the prophet Mani in Persia in the 3rd century, this religion spread rapidly eastward. It taught that the world was divided between light and darkness, spirit and matter. It had elaborate cosmology and beautiful ritual practices. Several important Manichaean texts were written in Sogdian, and Sogdian merchants helped spread the religion across Asia. This religious diversity might seem strange to us. We often think of religious identity as fixed and exclusive. But for the Sogdians, religion was one aspect of life among many. They could be devout in their beliefs, while also being pragmatic about fitting into different societies. They could sincerely embrace new faiths while maintaining connections to old traditions. The religious art the Sogdians created reflects this diversity. In excavated Sogdian buildings, we find Zoroastrian fire altars near Buddhist statues. We find Christian symbols alongside images from Persian mythology. This wasn't confusion or superficiality. It was a sophisticated cosmopolitanism, an ability to hold multiple cultural identities simultaneously. Sogdian communities outside Sogdiana itself were called colonies, though that word doesn't quite capture what they were. These weren't conquests or settlements backed by military force. They were commercial outposts, neighborhoods in foreign cities where Sogdians gathered to support each other and conduct business. The largest Sogdian colonies were in China. From the 4th century onward, as the Silk Road trade intensified, thousands of Sogdians settled in Chinese cities. They concentrated in Chang'an, the capital, and in other major commercial centers. These communities grew large and prosperous enough to maintain their distinct identity across generations. A Sogdian growing up in Chang'an lived between two worlds. At home, his family spoke Sogdian, ate Sogdian food, and followed Sogdian customs. They might worship at a Sogdian temple or church. They married other Sogdians, maintaining family networks that stretched back to Central Asia. But outside the home, they lived in a Chinese city under Chinese law, in a Chinese cultural environment. Many Sogdians took Chinese names alongside their Sogdian ones. This made official business easier and showed respect for Chinese culture. Some Chinese surnames like Kang, An, and Shi became particularly associated with Sogdian families. A Chinese person meeting someone named Kang would likely assume they had Sogdian ancestry. The Sogdian homes in Chinese cities were comfortable, sometimes luxurious. Successful merchants built large compounds with multiple courtyards. The walls were decorated with paintings in Sogdian style, showing feasts, hunts, and religious scenes. These paintings are precious to historians because they show us details of Sogdian life that written sources don't reveal. Sogdian women in these communities had significant roles. While traveling merchants were almost always men, the family businesses back home were often managed by women during the years their husbands and sons were away. Women arranged marriages, managed household finances, and sometimes even participated directly in trade. The sources show Sogdian women owning property and engaging in business transactions. Education was highly valued. Sogdian children learned to read and write in both Sogdian and Chinese. They studied mathematics for business. Boys learned the family trade by accompanying fathers or uncles on shorter trips before eventually undertaking the long journeys themselves. Girls learned household management and often some business skills as well. The Sogdian colonies maintained connections with each other and with Sogdiana itself. Letters traveled back and forth, carrying news and business information. Family members might be scattered across thousands of miles, but they stayed in touch as much as the slow communications of the ancient world allowed. A letter found in Dunhuang, written by a Sogdian merchant to his business partner, speaks of loneliness and homesickness, but also determination to succeed. These communities also entertained themselves. The Sogdians loved music and dance. They developed distinctive musical styles that blended Central Asian and Chinese elements. Sogdian musicians and dancers became famous in China. At Tang Dynasty court parties, Sogdian performers were in high demand, their whirling dances and exotic music thrilling Chinese audiences. Food was another way Sogdians maintained their identity. They prepared traditional dishes even in distant lands. They particularly loved wine, which they made from the grapes grown in Sogdian valleys. Sogdian wine became famous across Central Asia and China. Chinese poets wrote about it, praising its quality. Wine shops run by Sogdians were popular gathering places, but life in these colonies wasn't always easy. The Sogdians were foreigners, always to some degree outside the society they lived in. They faced discrimination at times. Chinese authorities sometimes viewed them with suspicion. During periods of xenophobia or political instability, foreign communities could become scapegoats. The Anlushan rebellion of the 8th century was a turning point. And Lushan was a general of Sogdian and Turkish ancestry who rebelled against the Tang dynasty. The rebellion devastated China and killed millions. Although many Sogdians remained loyal to the Tang, the rebellion led to increased suspicion of foreigners. Life became harder for Sogdian communities in China after this. Despite challenges, the Sogdian colonies persisted for centuries. They adapted to changing circumstances. As Islam spread across Central Asia in the 8th and 9th centuries, many Sogdians converted. The Sogdian language gradually gave way to Persian and Arabic in Central Asia, and to Chinese in the east. But the trading networks and business practices the Sogdians had developed continued under new names and new identities. Silk was the most famous commodity of the Silk Road, and Sogdian merchants carried vast quantities of it. Chinese silk was prized across the ancient world for its quality and beauty. The Chinese had perfected sericulture, the raising of silkworms and production of silk thread. They kept the process secret for centuries, giving them a monopoly on silk production. Silk was ideal for long-distance trade. It was valuable relative to its weight, meaning a camel could carry a fortune in silk without being overburdened. It didn't spoil like food or break like pottery. The wealthy across Asia, the Middle East, and even Europe desired it. Chinese silk found its way to Roman senators' togas, Persian nobles' robes, and Central Asian princes' banners. But the Sogdians carried much more than silk. From China came porcelain, that remarkable ceramic that was harder and more beautiful than any pottery made elsewhere. They carried tea, which was beginning to become popular outside China. They carried paper, another Chinese invention that would transform civilizations. They carried lacquerware, those elegant items coated with the sap of the lacquer tree. Traveling west, the Sogdians carried very different goods. From Central Asia itself came horses, particularly the famous Fergana horses, that Chinese emperors prized for their size and strength. These horses were said to sweat blood, though the red sweat was probably caused by parasites under their skin. Regardless, they were magnificent animals, and transporting them was a major undertaking. Glassware traveled east from the Roman world and Persia. Glass was made in China, but Western glass had different qualities, especially the clear, colorless glass that Roman craftsmen perfected. Glass vessels, beads, and decorative items were luxury goods in China. A single fine glass bowl might be worth a small fortune. Precious stones and minerals moved in all directions. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, with its deep blue color, was treasured for jewelry and decoration. Jade, from various sources, was particularly prized in China for both ornamental and ritual purposes. Gold and silver in the form of coins, bullion, and crafted objects constantly flowed along the trade routes. Spices were another major trade category. Black pepper from India, cinnamon from Southeast Asia, and various aromatic plants from across Asia were in demand for cooking, medicine, and religious ceremonies. These light but valuable goods were perfect for long-distance trade. A merchant could carry enough spices to make his fortune while leaving room for other goods. Textiles of many types moved along the Silk Road: wool from Central Asian sheep, cotton from India, linen from various sources, and specialty fabrics like Persian brocade all found markets. The Sogdians themselves produced some textiles, particularly carpets, and felt items made from wool. Books and ideas traveled too, though they're harder to trace than physical goods. Buddhist sutras went from India to China. Zoroastrian texts moved westward. Scientific and mathematical knowledge from Greek, Indian, and Chinese sources mixed and flowed in all directions. The Sogdians, literate and multilingual, were carriers of this intellectual cargo. Medicine and medical knowledge was valued everywhere. Chinese herbal remedies went west. Indian Ayurvedic knowledge spread. Greek medical texts traveled east. Plants with medicinal properties were cultivated and traded. Physicians themselves sometimes traveled the Silk Road, and medical knowledge was exchanged along with more tangible goods. Musical instruments provide a fascinating example of cultural exchange. The pipa, a stringed instrument that became central to Chinese music, probably originated in Persia and came to China via Sogdian merchants and musicians. Other instruments traveled in both directions, carried by people who understood that music, like trade, crosses all boundaries. Works of art were both trade goods and diplomatic gifts. Paintings, sculptures, and decorative arts moved along the Silk Road. Styles influenced each other. Chinese artists adopted Central Asian motifs. Persian craftsmen incorporated Chinese designs. The Sogdians, with their aesthetic sophistication, were both carriers and creators of this artistic exchange. The profit margins on all these goods varied enormously depending on local supply and demand, the condition of the goods after the journey, and the merchant's negotiating skill. A shrewd Sogdian merchant studied markets carefully. He learned what was scarce in each location and what was plentiful. He timed his arrivals to coincide with festivals or seasons when particular goods were in high demand. The golden age of the Sogdians lasted roughly from the 4th to the 9th centuries. During these 500 years, they were the preeminent merchants of the Silk Road, and Sogdian communities flourished across Asia. But nothing lasts forever. The world that had enabled Sogdian success gradually changed, and the Sogdians had to change with it. The Arab conquest of Central Asia in the 8th century was a major turning point. Islamic armies swept through Sogdiana, conquering its cities and incorporating them into the growing Islamic Caliphate. The Sogdians initially resisted, but eventually submitted. Many converted to Islam over the following generations. The old Zoroastrian religion declined, and with it, one of the pillars of Sogdian identity. Conversion to Islam didn't immediately end Sogdian distinctiveness. For a time, Sogdian Muslims maintained their language and cultural traditions. But gradually, Persian became the dominant language of the region. The Sogdian script fell out of use. New generations learned to write in Arabic or Persian rather than Sogdian. The language didn't disappear overnight, but by the 10th or 11th century, it was clearly in decline. In China, the situation was also changing. The Anlushan rebellion had devastated the Tang dynasty. Although the dynasty survived for another century and a half, it never fully recovered its former strength. The cosmopolitan openness that had welcomed foreign merchants became tinged with xenophobia. Life became harder for non-Chinese residents of Chinese cities. The Tang dynasty finally fell in 907, ushering in a period of division called the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. This instability disrupted trade. The Silk Road never completely closed, but the flow of goods decreased. Sogdian communities in China found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. Many Sogdians in China assimilated completely into Chinese society. They adopted Chinese customs entirely, stopped speaking Sogdian, and their descendants became simply Chinese. The process of assimilation was gradual and probably involved much sadness and loss. But it also represented survival and adaptation, qualities the Sogdians had always possessed. In Central Asia itself, the Sogdian cities continued, but under new management and with new identities. Samarkand remained an important city, but it was now an Islamic city where Persian was spoken. Bukhara became a center of Islamic learning, famous for its scholars rather than its merchants. The cities endured, but the Sogdian culture that had made them distinctive was transformed beyond recognition. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century were another massive disruption. Mongol armies conquered much of Asia, destroying cities and slaughtering populations. Samarkand and Bukhara were both devastated. The Silk Road trade actually revived under Mongol rule because the Mongol Empire stretched from China to Eastern Europe, making the routes safer than they had been in centuries. But by this time, the people doing the trading were not Sogdians, but rather other groups. By the 14th century, the Sogdians as a distinct people had effectively vanished. Their language was no longer spoken. Their religion had been replaced. Their cities had been conquered and reconquered. Their descendants were scattered across Asia, absorbed into other populations. It seemed like a complete disappearance, but was it? The Sogdians left traces that lasted. The business practices they developed continued. The routes they pioneered remained important. The cities they helped build are still inhabited today. Samarkand is now in Uzbekistan, still a beautiful city, still reflecting centuries of history. Bukhara remains a center of culture and learning. The Sogdian language, though no longer spoken, was preserved in manuscripts found in the 20th century. In the deserts of western China, in the ruins of abandoned cities, archaeologists found letters, contracts, and Buddhist texts written in Sogdian. These documents let us hear Sogdian voices across the centuries. We can read a merchant's letter complaining about a business partner. We can see a woman's signature on a property document. We can study religious texts and learn what the Sogdians believed. The genetic legacy of the Sogdians persists in modern Central Asian populations. People living in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and neighboring countries carry Sogdian ancestry. They may not speak Sogdian or practice Zoroastrianism, but they are descendants of those ancient merchants. Perhaps most importantly, the Sogdians demonstrated something important about human civilization. They showed that success doesn't require military conquest or political domination. They proved that commerce, culture, and communication could connect distant peoples and create prosperity. They exemplified the cosmopolitan ideal, maintaining their identity while embracing diversity. In our world, we still face the challenges the Sogdians navigated. How do we maintain cultural identity in a globalized world? How do we respect traditions while adapting to change? How do we build trust and cooperation across linguistic, religious, and ethnic boundaries? The Sogdians don't give us easy answers, but their story offers insights. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine those ancient caravans moving slowly across the desert. Picture the Sogdian merchant, far from home, perhaps looking at the stars and thinking of his family. He knows the risks he faces, but he also knows the opportunities. He carries goods that will delight people in distant cities. He carries letters and news that will connect separated communities. He is a link in a chain that spans continents. The Sogdians are gone, but the Silk Road they traveled still exists in our imagination. It represents connection, exchange, and the human drive to explore and trade. It reminds us that for thousands of years, people have been finding ways to cross barriers and build relationships across vast distances. Rest now, and let the story of these remarkable merchants accompany you into sleep. Their journeys are over, but their legacy remains. In the morning, you will wake to your own world, but perhaps you'll carry with you a sense of connection to those travelers of long ago who understood that the world is smaller than it seems when we have the courage to reach across divides. Sleep well, traveler. The Silk Road awaits in your dreams.